It's been one of the great highlights of my life in the past year to be able to work with these artists because of how generous they've been with their artworks and what they offer to all of us through their work. I'm honored and humbled to be able to show their work in this context and share it with the public. So just an additional thanks to them. Through their work, these artists build upon the tradition of Black self-representation as an antidote to colonial images. The exhibition frames their work as a creative index, an alternative to the barrage of photographs of Black people who have been arrested, incarcerated, and who have died often by violent means. Through a variety of innovative approaches, each of the artists addresses the paradox of being Black in America, which is to be alive but to have little social value. The artists' works focus on the resilience and beauty of Black people despite living in dire political and social conditions. Please find more information about the exhibition, including the newly posted VR experience, which I'm really excited about, programs like these coming up, but also programs that have happened that have been recorded and are posted to the website. There's also very special breathing meditation that Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle put together and generously allowed me to share with everyone through the exhibition website. So I highly recommend that. It's a very moving and engaging experience. And also you can find information about the national tour of the exhibition. It's going to the Palo Alto Art Center in May. It's going to the art galleries of Black Studies at UT Austin, where Dr. Smith teaches, and then it's going to the Hunter Art Galleries in January of next year. And the website for the exhibition is theblackindex.art. So now I'd like to turn to our speaker, Dr. Cherise Smith. She and I are trying to figure out exactly when we met. It's been over 20 years. And it's just, again, a great pleasure to work with amazing people who contribute so much. And so Dr. Smith is one of those. She's a professor of art history, specializing in American art after 1945. Especially as it intersects with the politics of identity, race, and gender. She is the chair of the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, and she's the founding executive director of the art galleries at Black Studies, which consists of the Christian Green Gallery and the Idea Lab. Dr. Smith previously directed the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies and co-directed the Op-Ed Project. Her most recent book, titled Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective, published last year, University of Texas Press, surveys Charles's career, exploring the artist's sampling approach to provocative anti-Black stereotypes, as well as his analysis of African American masculinity and sports culture. She's also author of Enacting Others, Politics of Identity, and Eleanor Anton, Nikki S. Lee, Adrian Piper, and Anna DeVere Smith, which was published in 2011 by Duke University Press. And in that book, she examines how identity is negotiated in performance art, in which women artists take on the characteristics and manners of a racial, ethnic, and gendered other. She has also published several articles that have appeared in publications such as Art Journal and African Arts. So Professor Smith is going to give a short presentation about Charles's work, and she and I are going to have a conversation. And after about 45 minutes, then I will be able to moderate questions from all of you for her to respond to. So please type your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And like previous programs, this event is being recorded and it will be available shortly on the exhibition website. So for now, please join me in welcoming the esteemed Professor Cherise Smith.
Hello, am I with you?
I think your video needs to be on, and now you're with us. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, evening here in Texas, afternoon in California. Bridget, thank you so much for having me participate in the programming for the Black Index. It's really my pleasure both to be part of the programming, but also to be a host site for the exhibition. And I will just remind you that it was also my pleasure a couple of years ago to see you give a presentation on the Black Index before it was even a show. It was just some really fantastic ideas in a slideshow that you were able to put together in a really impressive way in the Black Index. So thank you again for inviting me. Allison and Chris, thank you so much for your tech support this evening. So what I'm just going to do is talk with you a little bit about the book, and then Bridget and I will open it up to some questions. So now I'm showing you the cover of the book. It is a beautiful, big coffee table looking book that has, and I'm just going to show you it, what it looks like in physical space. Just a wonderful, nearly 5-pound object that has a recent work by Michael Ray on the cover that you see now. The book opens onto an interview. I thought that it was important to hear from the artist in his own words, first and foremost. And then the second thing that you encounter is the plates. There are 100 color plates that are in the middle of this beautifully produced and designed book by UT Press. And then there is an essay. I will show you a picture of that momentarily. And so what this book does that has not been done before is to gather together his work from the early 1990s when he first got his MFA to work that was just produced in the last 2 years. The other thing that the book does is to show work, some of which is in Europe, some of which is here at the University of Texas campus, especially sculpture, for which Charles is not very widely known, except that he does work in sculpture, and it does something very different than what the paintings do. So it's useful for people to be able to see that. And so then the last section of the book is text, and it is sectioned out into not quite chapters, but the size of chapters without chapter divisions, let me say. So it's really kind of a book within a book. The text itself is a substantial object that really historicizes Charles' work within the 1990s and the early 2000s. And it has the second part, which is all of the images. So where I'd like to start with his work, though, is to tell you about a kind of controversy that his work was ensnared in the late 1990s. And what happened is that Michael Ray Charles and Kara Walker were the subject of a censorship campaign, a letter writing campaign that was started by more senior artists who sent letters to various colleagues in museums, in the academy, in galleries. And really their question was, why are these artists focusing on stereotypes of African Americans? Can't we put those to rest? And then the kind of second issue was, they are really just capitalizing on these stereotypes and marketing their work to non-Black collectors. And people had a real problem with that. And so this is an installation shot from an exhibition from 1997, started at the Blaffer in Houston, traveled to Cincinnati, to Austin, and to the Albright Knox. This, it shows you a couple of works from that period, gives you a sense of the fact that the work was looking like 19th century artifacts. Sometimes they look like posters. Sometimes they look like signs that you might encounter on a store or something. And that they also appropriate and or adapt icons, iconography that have been associated with caricatures of African Americans. And so on the right-hand side, you see a very open mouth figure with a big smile of red lips and big white teeth. The next image over to the left has a black-faced clown, and rather than playing with a kind of rubber ball, it is sports balls, footballs and basketballs that this figure is juggling. Then the far left image, for example, is similarly kind of sampling, appropriating a blackface character. And so this is one of the characters that might be called a Sambo character, might be called a Pickaninny character. Any number of other phrases might be attached to it depending on one's region or even the country that one is in. And so this is a work of his that is on the cover of his catalog from a show in 1998, but it also kind of comes to stand in for his work. And it's a work that really challenged people. And what's also interesting about the work is that with the word beware, we're not sure, one shouldn't be sure, if the viewer should be afraid of this boy or if the boy should be afraid of the viewer. And that is one of those kind of challenging things that Michael Ray's work does, is it kind of points at you and it kind of points back at itself. And so, you know, the interesting thing about his work, Kara Walker's work, and others from the time period is that they were not alone in having looked at and or used, sampled, appropriated stereotypical work, stereotypical images by the larger culture. And so this slide shows you works by Betty Saar, Jeff Donaldson, and Joe Overstreet, which each adapt the mammy figure. And sometimes that figure is called Aunt Jemima, which in these artworks, she is called that. But they do really different things with this icon, with this figure, with the character. You might say that they empower the figure. They, you know, kind of frame it in relation to the civil rights movement, or even in relation to the Black Power movement, certainly in relation regarding the Betty Saar piece. But so it was interesting then that it was more senior artists who had a history of using such stereotypical images in their own work, who were challenged by Walker's and Charles's use of the same material. And another slide that I'll show you here just gives you a sense that this idea of taking a stereotype or taking stereotypical iconography and trying to do something different with it is not new. This is work from 90 years ago. We've got Bearden, Motley, and Hayden really thinking through some of the exaggerated features that are part of the iconography of African Americans and trying to change it. And so Michael Ray's work is absolutely in this tradition. And so his work, Walker's work, is really of a kind with a long or a very deep use of stereotypes, engagement with stereotypes from this time period. This slide shows you a spread of Chris Rock from the late 1990s with Annie Leibovitz photographing him. And then on the left, there is Homie the Clown from In Living Color, which was a sketch show that was done by the Wayans brothers, and there was lots of stereotypical imagery and narratives of different kinds that were kind of excoriated and played out in that show. And so it's really a moment that is happening in the late 1990s when people are wrestling with stereotypes and stereotypical narratives and icons, not just in the art world, but more broadly. And so part of why things kind of come to a head in the late 1990s is that in the 80s, there was an increased interest in objects that are sometimes called Black memorabilia, sometimes called Black collectibles. I prefer the term that Patricia Turner coined, contemptible collectibles. And so in the mid to late 80s, African-American collectors begin to collect these materials. Partially, they're moved to take the material off of the market, and partially they're moved to just own it because they think they're beautiful objects. And so a real market, as these books attest, sprouts up around contemptible collectibles. And these are covers from some books that were produced at the time to give collectors some sense of the worth and the value of the objects that they were collecting. Oprah Winfrey is collecting contemptible collectibles at this time, Spike Lee, for example, and certainly Charles is also collecting this material, which he will then use in his own artwork. And so in this show from 1997, there is this painting that's on the right-hand side, Bamboozled, that is on display. Spike Lee visits the exhibition among other entertainers, and Spike Lee sees this, this painting. This painting is also then kind of referring back to Spike Lee's movie Malcolm X, in which Denzel Washington as Malcolm X talks about how Black people have been bamboozled. And so there's this interesting inter-artist, inter-medium dialogue that happens between the filmmaker and the artist that comes together with Bamboozled. So painting is first, the movie is second. And the book also does some historicizing of their relationship and working together, and the kind of art directing work that Charles did within the film Bamboozled. And so just to kind of conclude this section, I'm showing you work from the late 1990s and late 80s in which other artists who are just a few years older than Charles, a few years older than Kara Walker, are similarly engaging with stereotypes, narratives, icons surrounding African Americans. And so we've got Renee Cox, who reimagines what Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima might be in another time and space. Carrie Mae Weems is making a tableau within a kitchen using contemptible collectibles. And then Fred Wilson, in a more kind of conceptual way, is thinking through what we see when we see images of African Americans. Do we see them as family and as part of us, or do we see them as stereotypes or as caricatures, as not real people? So I'm going to stop share now, and Bridget and I will talk.
Thank you. I was just told that we were having some technical difficulties at the beginning, and I welcomed everyone, and no one heard it. So I'm going to back up a little bit and briefly welcome everyone before I start engaging with Professor Smith about this whole project on Michael Ray Charles's work. So a belated but still heartfelt welcome to everyone. I am delighted to have the exhibition taking place and to be able to have the opportunity to speak with you in programs like these with amazing scholars like Cherise Smith. So I am Bridget Cooks, and I'm a professor of art history and African American studies at UC Irvine, and I'm also the curator of the show. And I wanted to thank some people who have been instrumental in this whole project. Sarah Watson, who's chief curator at the Hunter Art Galleries, who had the idea to take my concept of the Black Index and make it into an exhibition, and to give me a venue at Hunter to do so. The show will be traveling to Palo Alto, to the Palo Alto Art Center in the spring, opening May 1st, if the pandemic allows. And then we'll go to the art galleries at Black Studies, where Professor Smith will take care of it. And then it will go to Hunter in a year, opening next January. So I wanted to make sure that everyone heard that. And I also wanted to thank artist, professor, and director of the University Art Galleries, Kevin Appel at UCI, Allison Unzicker, who is the director and gallery curator of the Contemporary Art Center Gallery, and the preparators who really hung the work with a great deal of love, and care, Andrew McNeely and Tariq Garrett. I wanted to also just give a little bit of information about the exhibition, and then to turn to Michael Ray Charles to make that connection so that you're getting the most out of this conversation that we're having. So the Black Index is an exhibition of work by 6 contemporary artists: Alicia Henry, Lava Thomas, Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle, Dennis Delgado, Titus Kaffar, and Whitfield Lovell. It really is an all-star cast. And I do want to say that one of the highlights of my life in the last year, if not longer, has been the opportunity to work with these artists and to really work through my own ideas about their art. It's particularly timely because of my own desire to try to work through the normality of Black death, to try to deal with that on a daily basis. And I was excited. It was very moving for me to find artists who were also working with those challenges in their lives and also their art. And that's really the baseline for the exhibition. So through their work, these artists build upon the tradition of Black self-representation as an antidote to colonialist images. And in the exhibition, I framed their art as a creative index, an alternative to the barrage of photographs of Black people who have been arrested, incarcerated, and who have died often by violent means. And I really do mean barrage, that it has been overwhelming to see so much death and murder, often without any kind of real recourse or sense of grievance. Through their variety of innovative approaches to art making, all 6 of the artists address the paradox of being Black in America, which is in part to be alive, but to have little social value. And the artist's works focus on mourning, I think, but also the resilience and beauty of Black people, despite living in dire political and social conditions. And lastly, I just want to make sure everyone knows about the website for the show, thebblackindex.art. We were able to launch a really lovely virtual reality tour made by Bruce Warner, which is really fantastic. And you can find information there about programs. There's also a really wonderful breathing meditation that's newly posted to the website by Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle, which I recommend. And you can find more information about the national tour. Future programs will be posted there. Information about them it's there now, but past and future programs are all being recorded, and you can watch them or tell other people to watch them at a later date. Okay. I think that's what you missed. That's the gist of what you missed. But I did want to say something about this program, because Michael Ray Charles is not an artist in the exhibition, and yet you know, Professor Smith and I thought it was really important to talk about his work in this context, because he's someone who for decades now has been dealing with a Black index, right? A kind of popular process of classifying and finding images of Black people. And they're twisted images, and they're not true images, but they have a great deal of power. And we wanted to be able to talk about his work in this recent scholarship in the vein of Black indexicality, and really think through Michael Ray Charles's work, which is very challenging and intellectual, and also very graphic and immediate. There's lots of layers to it. And so I'm asking that we think about his work in this context. So thank you for your presentation so far. And I wanted to ask a series of questions. And one of the questions is about what I just said, a kind of false image or false representation, a false kind of finding aid in the kind of popular Black Americana or contemptible collectibles, as you mentioned. And I mean, for some people, particularly students, they may have not come across these images before, but they have endured for hundreds of years in different forms. And I think it might be helpful to just, you know, in a simple way, just say why these images in your analysis have endured, and how do we engage with them now?
Yeah, that's a really challenging question. And on the one hand, one would assume that, or hope that people hadn't encountered them before, but we both know that in the last couple of years, there was the Gucci turtleneck. There was the Virginia governor who was shown to have put on blackface in the 1980s while he was in medical school. And I think there was a Prada purse that had a kind of blackface figure. And so lots of controversy around these. And then the other thing that probably students will be familiar with, at least some students, might be a ghetto fabulous party where blackface often happens, and others. You know, I know here at UT, another big state school, and Irvine is not as big as UT, but, you know, Cinco de Mayo parties turn into things that they really shouldn't be, for example. And so there are ways that these icons of and stereotypical narratives about particular ethnicities, especially those people that are more disempowered, and so we might even include women in that group, Asian Americans, Native Americans, that, you know, sometimes have something to do with the physiognomy, the way that people look, that gets exaggerated, or a particular clothing style that might have been associated with a group of people 100 or even 200 years ago. And so, you know, there are these kind of stories and pieces of pictures and images that have just persisted for hundreds of years. And, you know, if you think about why they were created in the first place, to, you know, kind of, on the one hand, show a real affection for the culture of African Americans, but on the other hand, there was a real violence associated with kind of caricatured way in which those things were acted out. And I'm talking about minstrelsy now, blackface minstrelsy. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, then you definitely want to check out Eric Lott's book, Love and Theft. Does that?
Yeah, I think that's helpful because, you know, some of us who are really invested and engaged in the visual are aware of these, this history and these objects, and other people are less aware.
Yeah.
What's interesting is often with students when there's a blackface party, and they have them here also at UCI, you know, you get an apology and you get a, oh, I didn't know. But it's like, how did you not know? Like, how can you not know but replicate something that's been happening over and over again? So, you know, what's your thoughts about the function, just to continue some of the kind of basic information? Why do they endure, but what's the function of it? What function do they serve, or what desire do they fulfill that we are dealing with them over and over again?
I think that in the end, they're all about power. I mean, these stereotypes are all about power. They are about who has the power to wield images and stories against other people, to capitalize on them and to make money on them. If you think about certain cartoon images, Mickey Mouse, for example, and things that just keep showing up, and every generation seems to experience them anew and somehow not know that they existed, except that we are inculcated and kind of taught that this is normal and this is regular. And so, yeah, they're about power, and the power then gets kind of smashed together with capital, and who can actually control and sell and reproduce these objects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that you talk about in the book, a citation of Michael Ray Charles talking about his work, is how, you know, for him, everyone is implicated in this work. You know, not white people or even people who are white supremacists, regardless of their race, but Black people also. And that we are all implicated because, in part, these images are part of consumer culture. So,
and that we all consume them.
And we all consume them, right? So, you know, you can go to a Black person's house and find Aunt Jemima pancake mix, right? It's like, it's a trusted brand, it's a familiar taste, and, you know, and maybe there's a sense of certainly wanting to have what's considered the best tasting product in your house, but also a sense of maybe being numb to anti-Black images, and also perhaps feeling that it's futile. You know, there's a futility in resisting, because we have such a long history. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that some of it is really, we actively consume it. And I think about, you know, a group from when we were growing up, like NWA, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a stereotypical idea of a certain set of figures and peoples from a particular kind of neighborhood that then got enlarged even. And then, you know, their music kind of acts out these characters. Now, maybe those people were the same as the characters they played, but probably there was a little bit of light between the characters that they played as Dr. Dre, let's just say, and the person who is that real person.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so, you know, I think about, or even, you know, I showed the example of the Wayans Brothers show. You know, I think that a lot of times, a lot of cultural products that we are consuming have aspects of these kinds of stereotypes and narratives, and even iconography still, and we're not always fully aware that we're consuming a stereotype, though sometimes we are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my 12-year-old just introduced me to All American, and I'm watching this show, and on the one hand, I'm like, oh, this is awful. And on the other hand, oh, this is really engaging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think that's really the crux of it, that we have to be aware of how alluring they are and how we really are interested in them, and they kind of fulfill stories that we've been told all our lives. And so, yeah, there's something to them.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you about this. I mean, thinking about popular culture and the way that we consume images. And I was recently talking to my grad students in my Black visual culture about the Chappelle Show. Right. So this is a show by these brilliant, writers, Dave Chappelle and Neil Brennan, that have really changed through comedy, popular television, and what to expect from a comedy show. There's a lot of cultural criticism, which is not new to great comics, but it's interesting to think of how, even recently, Dave Chappelle will pull his show off the network. And, once you make a joke and people are laughing, you're not exactly sure who's laughing and exactly what they're laughing at. So once, the image is out there, the performance is out there, it's out of your hands.
Yeah.
Some people will laugh because they see the criticism and the humor, and other people laugh because it's fulfilling stories that maybe contribute to anti-Blackness. And, as the producer, you don't have much control over that. So, but this leads me then to Michael Ray Charles's work, because he's not replicating these stereotypical images, right? He is recreating them with a difference. And I certainly think, and you in your book, we think of, and he of course thinks of his work as an intervention, but how can we really characterize, how do you think about his work as an intervention or a disruption? And how does that work? Sort of when you intervene into a long history of anti-Blackness with different information or a different strategy, where does that take us to?
I mean, yeah, I think that's an interesting question and problem. One of the ways that we can answer this is how they're different from the objects. So we know that he collects these things himself. And he's got an origin story of how he began using these things in the first place, and that is that someone gave him a small figure that had big eyes and a big round O mouth, and that it was a plastic figure with very black plastic on the outside, and so he was like, what is this thing? What is it portraying? Who and what is this supposed to be? And that was the figure that he first kind of adapted into his art. And, in the kind of typical graduate student MFA way, one of the first things that he did was to replicate this actual object. So he went to the ceramic studio and made hundreds of them. And that was an installation. And then the next thing that he did with them was to make these drawings that kind of showed it being manufactured, and that's actually the name of the piece. And so, one of the things that I love about that object is that on the one hand, you can see how an artist does their work, adapting and figuring, putting it in different media and moving it in different directions. But then also, first he makes a bunch of them, and then he imagines what it looks like to make a bunch of them, and then he thinks about, oh, these images are manufactured and they're churned out over and over and over again, and we just keep consuming them over and over and over again. So it kind of goes from this object-centered thing to a more conceptual kind of critical intervention in what these things do. So I think that's one way to kind of separate out how he uses the objects. And, I think it's also useful to think of someone like David Leventhal. This is an artist that people may not know, but in the late 1990s, he too is using contemptible collectibles. He collects them and then he photographs them, but he photographs them using the large scale Polaroid camera. And so they're these big, square, glossy images. But what he does is to photograph them very, very close. And so an object that might really only be this big is this big. And so he's both appropriating the object, but then doing something different to them by blowing them up as large as they are and kind of showing their pretty shiny surfaces. So I think that there are, various ways that people can engage with, and artists have engaged with such stories and objects.
Mhm.
And the other thing that I would point out is that Andres Serrano is also using this stuff right now. He's got a show up on the East Coast where he has taken these objects and photographed them in the way that he does, more like portraits. And so those are three different artists doing very different things with these objects. And so if Serrano is thinking about an Aunt Jemima statue as an object that he wants to kind of lovingly make a portrait of, Charles is, expanding it, making it bigger, making it rougher, and hearkening back to the older things, but actually making it and adjusting it. So how people engage with the different objects and do different things with it is important, the formal experimentation.
Yeah, so I have, the more you talk, the more questions I have for conversation, because you're bringing out all these layers. So, the questions I have in mind immediately, just going off of what you said, is I'd love for you to speak to the significance of text as part of this intervention, how important text is in these works that he's doing, where he's taking these images and creating something else. And then the other part of that, in terms of thinking about intervention and visual strategies, what does it mean to make these new images as painting, as fine art? Because we're not finding them largely in fine art. And there's a whole history in 19th century painting, American painting, where we can find lots of these anti-Black exaggerated stereotypes. But he's looking at these objects, like you said, the one that he got, and he was like, what is this? What do I do with this? Part of the intervention immediately is showing the process of them being made and focusing on this is a constructed image. But I'd love to hear you talk more about the role of text with image in the intervention, and what does it mean to take these multiple fine art ready-mades and make it fine art, popular art ready-made to fine art. Is there something about the museum or gallery context that helps to make an intervention?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I'm going to start by saying that he studied advertising, and that is very clear in his paintings. And what you see is him using the Sun-Made brand materials. You see him using Arm & Hammer, for example, covers from early 20th century picture magazines and illustrated magazines. So there's something about the graphic arts that he really admires. And that's really, really evident in his early work. So that's one place that the texts come from. The other thing is, and I'm going to get back to the text, but interestingly, when he first comes on the scene, people call him a folk artist. And there's nothing folk artist about his work.
Meaning, did they mean perhaps that he was untrained, that he didn't go to school, and
yes,
that there was something naive about his work?
Yes.
But was that more about the materiality of the work, or was it about, if he knew better, he wouldn't show stereotypes?
Well, I think there are two things. I think it's the materiality of the work, because it, in the beginning, kind of masqueraded, for lack of a better word, like old playbills and like old 19th century objects. So he would either he'd make them on canvas or on paper. He would paint them, and then he would distress them so that they looked like they'd been folded over hundreds of years. And you can see the fold marks. And he would sand them so that it looked like they'd been worn out by people walking past them. So I think that's one reason. And because he was at that point using a style that was slightly more expressionistic, for lack of a better phrase. I'm just trying to put a word to why someone might say that. But then the second part of it is that, this is a 6'5" African-American man. And so I think people had, and I go into this in the book, a very paternalistic and xenophobic set of stereotypes that they applied to him. And one of them was, he couldn't possibly be an artist. He's supposed to be playing basketball or some other thing. And so, people look at him and assume that he couldn't be an artist with an MFA. They assume that he has to be a self-trained artist, for example. And so it was this interesting problem or, set of issues that surrounded him and his work in his early career.
Uh-huh. So,
sorry. And so what happens with the text is that he's looking at advertising. So he's using some of the same fonts, for example. He's using some of the same branding. But then he, sometimes it's a tongue-in-cheek an assumption that he thinks the viewer has about the figure in the work. Or sometimes it might be the figure talking back to the viewer. And so the text does different things in different artworks.
mm-hmm, okay. And so I wanted you to also speak to the idea of the possibility of using the art gallery or museum as an intervention, which is such a timely issue now with Black Lives Matter and museums scrambling to figure out how they can at least perform that Black Lives Matter. But also in your description of the physical presence of Charles, that it seems like just walking into the gallery is a kind of disruption, right? Which we know is the history of African-American artists, right? Like, you don't belong here.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking about the process of him walking into the gallery, being part of museum collections, right, in his body, but with images that I suppose would make some of the curators or directors blush, like, oh, this is how I see you. And now you're making me confront them. So just, any thoughts about, it is about the physical presence of the work, but also the artist himself.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it is a real intervention that his work has. And I'll tell you that he had a show here in Austin about a year ago. And the year before that, he had a fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. And so he had just a big walled studio, a studio with big walls. And so he made really big work. And this painting that he did for Austin is 20 feet tall by, 12 or 14 feet wide. And it is mostly a slave ship. And it's a vessel with all of these sails, but kind of embedded in the sails are blackface figures and kind of watermelon smiles. And so it's very challenging to describe. But
I was trying to see if there was an image of it in the PowerPoint, but can people find it online to look at it?
But the image on the cover has aspects of it.
Okay.
Would you like me to try to go back to that, or should we stay in?
Let's keep talking, and then we can go back at some point soon, because it's later than I thought. I'll ask you to show some of the later work, and then we'll go to Q&A. But please, finish your thought.
Yeah, so the work is absolutely an intervention. And I think that size, usually you're used to these little figures being this big and not this big. And you're used to them being mass produced and kind of perfect in their imperfectness or imperfection. And instead, he's got this kind of beautifully painted, grotesque figure of a Black person out of some white supremacist imagination. And so it does make people confront both the physicality of the objects, but also the ideas behind and embedded within the images themselves.
Mhm.
And you know, I don't remember if you met him when you visited.
I have not, and I've always wanted to. And when I did see him, I was a little starstruck, to tell you the truth. I thought, "Oh my gosh, that's Michael Ray Charles," you know. But no, it wasn't the right time for me to meet him. I was busy, but yeah.
Yeah, well, so the reason why I'm saying that, he was my colleague here at UT for, I don't know, 13 or so years, 12. But he is a very tall person with a presence, but he's also one of those people who's aware of the fact that his presence is big to some people. And so there's kind of I mean, you can see the standing up or the kind of shrugging, you know, the making the presence bigger and the making the presence smaller. And so, you know, and all of us do that in every setting. I mean, that is what Judith Butler describes in performativity, that we're always kind of doing something based on the context that we're in, performing our identities differently. But it does mean something in this conversation that we're having now, when we're talking about the violence that is wreaked on Black people's bodies. And so, you know, that is what the work is dealing with. It is violent images that are in people's heads, violent thoughts about Black people that are kind of embedded in these objects.
So I'm going to ask you one more question before, and I have more, but one more question before I ask you to show some of the later work that people might be less familiar with. And I wanted to ask a question particularly about mascots and branding, because, you know, that's certainly part of what he makes, you know, in his kind of body of work, right? That it's stereotypes, but then we have like the brand name Mammy is Aunt Jemima, you know, or, you know, the Uncle Tom, and there's different characters that we know through consumer culture. And so I did want to ask you about, in fact, I looked this up today to see what exactly is Quaker Oats doing, you know? So I saw that Aunt Jemima is still Aunt Jemima, but on the website for auntjemima.com, it says, "We're working on it." And it's like, okay, but meanwhile, you're still selling all the stuff, right? And it's like, yeah. And Uncle Ben's is now Ben's. But it's like, okay, well, but it's still Uncle Ben, you know? So, you know, I think the changes that are happening is because so many people have discovered that racism really exists because of, you know, the recorded murder of George Floyd this May. And so we have these gestures at making change, but they're really, well, I'll ask you what you think about them. I mean, because you've studied this body of work and the issues around it. You know, it's not something that's new to you to just start thinking about it in spring. But what do you think the resistance is now in 2020, even when people are moved to say, oh, maybe these things should go? Why is it that they're not really going? Or we can also think about, right, the Washington football team, right? So that football teams are also struggling with their branding and the use of Black people and Native American Indigenous people. I mean, I guess just speak to this moment.
Wow, that's a big and good question. I think it's all about money, isn't it? And that's the bottom line. You know, the Washington football team wasn't going to change their name until it hit their pocketbook, and they were sure that they were going to continue to be able to do that for as long as they wanted.
Right.
You know, I think on the one hand, brands like Quaker Oats must be doing some kind of calculation. How much do we have to change it for people to still recognize it, and keep it so that people can still recognize it? How much do we have to change it to appease people? And let's just say Black people, but I don't think it's just Black people. and to still make money selling what we're selling.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a really challenging problem. And I will say that you're right, Michael Ray is absolutely dealing with these mascots as mascots and also as kind of underground mascots. So I think that a Sambo figure is kind of an underground mascot, whereas in his Bamboozled painting, for example, he's actually appropriating the Atlanta Braves figure in his work. And so, there are two ways that it gets worked out. I am not plugged in. I'm going to do that.
Oh, okay. You're about to lose power. Okay. While you're doing that, I just want to say Jenna Dufour, who's this amazing visual arts librarian at UCI, she found a link to the Microwave Charles work at UT Austin that Professor Smith was mentioning. So I put it in the chat so everyone should be able to see it. And I'm going to look at it too because I haven't seen it before. So thank you so much for sending that. So we have about 15 minutes left. Would it be possible for you to show some of the slides of recent work, and then maybe people will have questions, and then I can read those to you?
Yeah, so when we were talking about text before, I wanted to show you this image. This is an appropriated cover from Time magazine.
I think you have to share your screen.
Oh gosh.
Let me stop my video so you can have more space. Perfect.
Okay, so this work is Fall of a Proper Nigga, Guilty, Not Guilty. And it is an appropriated cover from Time magazine. People who are not familiar with it, let me just tell you quickly that when O.J. Simpson was arrested for possibly murdering as a suspect for murdering his ex-wife, the magazine designers darkened his skin to make him look more menacing. And so there was a very big controversy within the larger kind of media world and even pop culture about how O.J. Simpson who had been a darling, not necessarily of African American people, but of non-African American people, that he had been made more menacing, more scary by darkening his skin. And so that was a real issue. And so Michael Ray is dealing with that in this piece. But, the text, he appropriates the text. So it looks like Time magazine, but he's also kind of engaging with, oh my gosh. The fire this time, please.
James Baldwin?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
So if you see on the top of the cover, it's Time, but it's This Time rather than just Time magazine. And then of course he's playing with the fall of this figure. And then using a kind of colloquial phrase for a racial epithet, one that is then kind of bandied about between people who are African American, but not solely African American people. And so the kind of engagement with OJ that Michael Ray does is something that continues to happen, and it gets smashed together with racial iconography, racist iconography. And I'm just showing you here some stills from Jay-Z's The Story of OJ. This is an interesting sketch that was done On the 28th of August in 2009, during a faculty governance committee meeting for the Center for African American Studies here at UT. It is, I really like this piece because it just kind of shows an artist at work and how there are particular images or kind of image sets that they deal with and that they kind of work out in multiple ways. And so here is the same kind of small, maybe Pickaninny figure, maybe Sambo figure that has white gloves on and dark skin, diminutive. And then there are these maybe columns, maybe ghosts, maybe clan figures. It's hard to tell. And we're going to show you how those get worked out in a moment. You know, one of the things that I wanted to show in the book was how he does work in different media. And while this is a painting of a stained glass window, Charles has actually made stained glass windows, not very much unlike the image on the left. And so this is another collaboration that he did with Spike Lee for Four Little Girls. And these are sculptures from earlier in this millennium, works from 2005 and 2006, in which he is looking at 19th century and even earlier images of African Americans and even Africans in the case of the left image of the croc jigger, and really just kind of putting different ideas and elements together. And so the croc jigger on the left-hand side is really a remake of the mechanical banks that show Black figures. It opens and closes, you know, with the figure coming up and down into the mouth of the crocodile. And so I showed you the sketch just a few minutes ago, and, you know, I guess it's a year later, these objects, the Three Graces, they come into being. They are sculptures that on the one hand look like bullets. On the other hand, they look like hooded figures, so they kind of nod to the Ku Klux Klan, but they also nod to religious imagery. On the other hand, they kind of hearken back to Mickey Mouse and other kind of blackface engaged figures. So, you know, these are really interesting works that we don't tend to associate with Michael Ray. And this is an object that is in the building in which I am right now. This is the Gordon White Building, Black and Latino Studies building here at UT. This is public sculpture that he made for part of the Landmarks project here at UT, public sculpture for new buildings. It is large-scale sculpture that is made out of constellations of wooden crutches. So they are made into stars, and then the stars are linked together into a kind of swirling diagonal funnel object. And then the most recent work that I have in this slideshow is Every Head is a World, Every World is a Head, which is a print portfolio that he did. What's really interesting about it is that you have these early 19th century inspired, 20th century inspired colors from old-fashioned printing that he has kind of borrowed from and cribbed from in the flowers. And then there are these kind of pixelated and or digitized figures that have been constructed out of kind of photographic images that then he has re-rendered in a more three-dimensional way through the printmaking process. And so you see that there are some ideas that just continue to show up in his work, dealing with 19th and early 20th century objects, for example, and how these challenging stereotypical images continue to be parts of our lives. So I'm going to stop sharing the slideshow. And
thank you.
if there are more questions from you, Bridget, or anyone else.
You know, I have a question, but I think I've talked enough. So I have a question here in the Q&A. So hello, my name is Khadija Silva, and I'm an undergrad at UCLA and art major. Thank you so much for this discussion. It's much appreciated and needed. Can you speak on the ideas of Afrotrope in relations to these works? When I say Afrotrope, I'm thinking on the idea of recurring visual forms that has emerged and become central to the formation of African diasporic culture and identity in the modern era. The reproduction of Black stereotypes in some of these works reminds me of the idea of Afrotrope, which sheds light on the lack of recognition, representations, and opportunities for Black bodies and Black art, but also relies on stereotypes and social constructs created by colonialism and Eurocentric white ideas. Could you speak to Khadija's question?
Well, Khadija, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, you know, when we're talking about a Black racial imagination and Afrotropes, things that keep recurring, narratives or images that keep recurring, I think on the one hand, there are positive ones, smiling faces, big smiles, for example, that then can also get twisted and be part of our racial imaginations today. And so, you know, unfortunately, it is all part of our kind of image consciousness, but identity consciousness, for lack of a better word. Yeah, I mean, I think I want to start there. Bridget, do you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, to me, it's just the persistence of racism. You know, we're dealing with the same images, sometimes modified in different forms over and over again. And so they are these tropes that we revisit because they don't go away. There still hasn't been any substantive change structurally in the way that we think about race and who qualifies as human. You know, and so we're fighting the same battles, or, you know, we're still in these war of images. That's, you know, I mean, Khadija being artist, right? I mean, artists of every generation are having to deal with, is there another way, you know, that I can come at this and take control of the visual form, because it's had so much control over the way that we've been perceived. So that's all I would add. We have another question here. Thank you, from Sally Stein. Thanking you for your work, for this illuminating discussion, and wanting you to say more about racial issues and Mickey Mouse. I think we mentioned that, but if there's more that you'd like to say about Mickey Mouse and race, and we were talking about that when we were discussing mascots and Aunt Jemima and branding.
Yeah. Hi, Sally. Good to hear from you. Thanks for coming out. Gosh, I mean, it's now an old image that we think is pretty benign, but you know, I think Mickey Mouse initially was a cat, and it was kind of a blackface cat that had white gloves. And big white eyes. And then at some point it kind of morphed to a mouse figure rather than a cat figure. But, you know, if you think about the very dark skin of the mouse character with the red lips, with the white gloves. It's, you know, kind of clearly hearkening back to early 20th century minstrelsy, not of the kind of 19th century variety, but more of the Al Jolson variety of the minstrel. And so, yeah, that is where it is. That's part of its history. And, you know, what I would remind all of us of, especially people who remember the old cartoons that are still shown from like the 40s and even earlier, is, you know, one of the pranks that they love, one of the tropes that those old comics love to do, is to put a cigar or a stick of dynamite in a character's mouth, and then it blows up, and then the character goes from being white to being in blackface. And the character has white eyes because the soot didn't get on their eyes, but then they have black skin, and, you know, their lips are bigger and their eyes are bigger. And so it's just, you know, part of the language of early cartoons, unfortunately.
I am, yes, Sally says thank you. And she sees it in a way that she'd missed. Thank you, Sally. So I'm going to take advantage. We just have a minute left, but I wanted you to just share some of your ideas about the later work. You know, the work with the crutches, the ideas and conversations, and the other two-dimensional work that looks more like what's on the cover of the book. Could you say more about where he's going now? I mean, I would have not recognized that sculptural work as Michael Ray Charles. And so, yeah, if you could just share some of your ideas about that.
Yeah, so with that piece, image, ideas, conversations, and let me see if I can remember the ideas, languages, conversations. That's the name of that work. You know, it was commissioned while the Black and Latino Studies building was being both refurbished and built, because it's an old building, used to be geography that they added on to. It was also the time when the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies was being created, and Mexican American and Latino Studies Department was being created. And so until that time, there were classes and there were centers on campus, but there were not kind of degree granting institutions where those scholars were in charge of their own degree plans and giving people PhDs. And so he's commissioned to do this both as a faculty member here, as sometimes part of the governing committee that would build up Black studies at UT. And so it was this interesting moment where some people on campus were not convinced that he should have been commissioned to do this work, because all they knew were the images that dealt with racial stereotypes. And people were clear that they didn't want to live to be living surrounded by the racial stereotypes within the building. And so, you know, it was this interesting thing where people both wanted him to do it and were worried about what might happen. So, you know, I'm just kind of providing that as a context. But what I think is really interesting is that he has these moments of working in a more abstract language, and certainly that work is among them. And even Three Graces, which I just showed, is in that style as well. And so, you know, it became this interesting moment where in the end, Landmarks and the university trusted that he would do something that appealed to the campus, and in fact he did. What has been interesting, what was interesting about this work was that he kind of latched on to this wooden crutches idea really early on in the process. And then it was, you know, trying to figure out how the crutches would work together. And, you know, I like to think of the crutches as, of course, they are prostheses that people use to help them walk and to help them ambulate. But they are, in my mind, a kind of stand-in for people. And so I think of, because they're objects that we use to make ourselves better or able to do what we want to do, I think of them as kind of stand-ins for people, substitutes for people. And so, you know, it's just an interesting thing to think about how they are in these star forms that then spread out. And one thing that I talk about in the book is how the form that it takes is kind of the same as a hurricane. And so, you know, this water motif, talking about Afrotropes, water is a very consistent theme throughout his work. As a Gulf resident, it's always present. And so that sculpture both has people in it, and it has that water kind of flooding, waving motion in it as well. So yeah, you know, his work is more diverse than people have known. And I'm especially interested and excited for the work, these large scale paintings that he's doing with black paint, which I'm just really excited about.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I didn't want you to, or I didn't want us to show that work and then not say anything about it, because I think it's just as provocative and interesting as the earlier work that you showed. Okay, now we're out of time. So let me thank you so much, Cherise Smith, for your work. And it really is an enormous book. It's almost 300 pages. The reproductions are gorgeous, and I'm really glad that you were able to have so much space so that people could really see good reproductions of the work. I also wanted to do a plug for the Black book. I'm thinking about Toni Morrison. This is a book that she published in 1974, which, for people who are interested in some of the issues that we've talked about here and that are explored in Charles's work, this is a really wonderful collection of not only Black Americana, but different kinds of images of Black people in popular culture. A lot of factual information, advertising as well, photographs. It's a major resource for much of the work by Betty Saar. She and I have talked about how important this book has been to her career. And it was recently republished, and now it's much easier to get, but it is a really wonderful resource in the discourse of thinking about these images and resistance to the ideas behind them. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for your patience. And please enjoy the website for the exhibition and the virtual reality tour. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming out.
Thank you.
Bye.